He told me I wouldn't last a month with him, but I didn't realize that sentence was already closing the door behind me. My name is Emily Carter, and I thought I understood pressure until I stepped into the Caldwell Foundation gala that night inside the Grand Regency Hotel in Manhattan. At 28, I worked event coordination jobs just to keep up with rent in a small Queens apartment, balancing spreadsheets, vendor calls, and late-night shifts that never seemed to end. That evening was supposed to be simple, just another high-profile charity event filled with wealthy guests who never noticed people like me unless something went wrong. I moved through the ballroom with practiced efficiency, adjusting floral arrangements, checking seating charts, and making sure every detail looked effortless under the golden chandeliers. That was when I first felt it, the shift in the room, the way conversations lowered as a man entered through the main doors without needing announcement or introduction. Richard Caldwell was 65, but age seemed irrelevant in the way he carried himself, like the entire city had once learned to move around him instead of through him. Black tailored suit, silver at his temples, and eyes that didn't scan the room so much as measure it. I had heard his name before whispered in staff rooms and security briefings, never spoken aloud by guests who understood boundaries. I was adjusting a table setting near the center stage when a guest accidentally bumped into me, sending a glass of water tipping over the edge. It didn't shatter, but the sound was enough to draw attention, including his. When I looked up, I found him watching me with an expression that didn't belong in a public gathering. It was calm, unreadable, and strangely focused, like I had interrupted something only he could see. He began walking toward me, and the space between us felt smaller with every step he took, until the noise of the gala seemed distant, muted, irrelevant. When he stopped in front of me, I forgot for a moment how to breathe normally. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself, didn't ask my name. Instead, he simply studied me for a long moment before speaking in a voice that carried quiet certainty rather than volume. "You won't last a month with me," he said, as if stating a fact already proven elsewhere. I should have laughed or walked away or called for my supervisor, but something in his tone made every instinct in me pause instead of react. Around us, the gala continued as if nothing unusual had happened, glasses clinking, soft music playing, people pretending not to notice the shift in energy. I finally managed to ask what he meant, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the event floor, then back at me, as though already considering something that had nothing to do with my confusion. "You're not supposed to be here by accident," he said finally, and that was when I realized this wasn't just a conversation, it was an assessment. Before I could respond, a staff coordinator approached with a sealed envelope bearing the Caldwell seal and placed it in my hands, saying my name like it had been expected. My fingers tightened around it without opening it, feeling the weight of something I didn't yet understand. Richard Caldwell turned slightly as if preparing to leave, then paused just long enough to add, "Open it when you're ready to stop running from decisions you already made." I stood in the middle of the ballroom holding the sealed envelope, feeling its weight in a way that had nothing to do with paper or wax but everything to do with expectation. Around me, the gala continued its elegant rhythm, yet everything felt slightly distant, like I had stepped half a pace outside of reality without moving my feet. Richard Caldwell had already turned away, his presence dissolving back into the crowd, as if he had never been there at all, which somehow made everything more unsettling. My supervisor passed by and gave me a polite nod, unaware that my hands were no longer focused on the event I was meant to manage, but on something that felt far more personal and far less optional. I stepped into a quieter corridor near the service entrance, where the noise of the gala softened into a low hum, and for the first time I allowed myself to look at the envelope properly. The Caldwell seal was pressed into the wax with precision, not decorative but official, like something that carried consequence rather than curiosity. I told myself I should wait until after my shift, but my fingers had already begun to open it before my thoughts could stop them. Inside was a single sheet of thick cream paper, and a line of text that made my chest tighten for reasons I could not immediately name. It was not a threat, not a demand, but an invitation written in a tone that assumed agreement had already been decided elsewhere. It instructed me to arrive at a specific address in Manhattan the following morning at 9 o'clock, where transportation would be arranged. At the bottom was a handwritten signature, Richard Caldwell, as if his name alone was enough to complete any instruction. I lowered the paper slowly, trying to process the idea that my life could shift direction so casually, without negotiation or explanation. A staff coordinator appeared again, as if timed to my reaction, and informed me that my shift for the evening was complete, and that arrangements had already been made for me to return home safely. I did not remember requesting anything of the sort. Outside the hotel, the night air felt colder than it should have for early autumn in New York City, and a black vehicle was already waiting at the curb with the engine running quietly. The driver opened the door without speaking, and I hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside because hesitation no longer seemed like something I was permitted. The interior was clean, minimal, and silent, with tinted windows that turned the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and white. No one explained where we were going, and I did not ask because something in me already understood that questions were not part of the arrangement I had just been placed inside. When the vehicle finally stopped in front of a private residence on the Upper East Side, I realized I had never been this far into Manhattan's quiet streets before. The building was not a typical mansion, but something more restrained, more controlled, with security that blended into architecture rather than standing apart from it. The door opened before I could knock, and a staff member guided me inside without urgency, as though I were expected but not surprising. Everything inside was quiet, polished, and deliberately designed to make noise feel unnecessary. Then I saw him again, Richard Caldwell, standing near a long window overlooking the city skyline, as composed as he had been at the gala. He did not greet me with surprise or welcome, only a steady acknowledgement as if I had simply arrived on time for something already scheduled. I held the envelope slightly tighter in my hand, realizing for the first time that whatever I had opened earlier was not an invitation at all, but the beginning of terms I had not yet fully read. I remember standing in that quiet Upper East Side room, the city skyline glowing behind him like a distant world I no longer felt part of. Richard Caldwell did not move when I entered further, only turned his head slightly, acknowledging my presence with the kind of calm certainty that made silence feel intentional rather than empty. I held the envelope close to my chest even though it suddenly felt unnecessary, as if whatever it contained had already been absorbed into the atmosphere between us. He gestured once toward a chair across from him, not as an invitation but as a direction, and I found myself obeying before I fully decided to. The room was minimal, expensive in a way that did not try to impress, only to exist without flaw. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and I became aware of how loudly my thoughts were moving compared to the stillness he carried. Finally, he broke the silence in a voice that was steady, controlled, and without hesitation. He asked if I had read what was inside the envelope. I told him I had. He nodded once, as if confirming something already expected. Then he explained, without urgency or emotion, that the document I held was not a proposal in the way most people understood proposals, but a structured arrangement tied to obligations he had inherited and decisions he now intended to finalize. The words were carefully chosen, each one placed like it had already been tested for reaction. I asked him why me, and the question sounded smaller in the space than it had in my mind. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the city for a moment, as if measuring distance between past and present, then turned back to me, and said I was not chosen randomly, that my presence at the gala had only confirmed what had already been under consideration. I felt my pulse tighten at the idea that my life could intersect with something so large without my awareness. He continued, explaining that certain agreements in his world required continuity, stability, and discretion, and that what he was offering was not a favor, but a form of protection tied to responsibility. The way he spoke made it sound like structure rather than emotion, like architecture rather than intimacy. I asked him what would happen if I refused, and for the first time his expression shifted slightly, not into anger, but into something more complex, like recognition of a question that had already been accounted for. He told me I was free to leave, but that freedom in his world often came with consequences I did not yet understand. There was no threat in his tone, only certainty, which somehow made it heavier. I looked down at the envelope again, then back at him, trying to reconcile the distance between my ordinary life and the framework he was describing as if it were inevitable. Outside the window, the city continued to move without awareness of what had just been placed inside this room. When I finally asked what I was supposed to do next, he replied simply that I would follow the schedule already set in motion, and that tomorrow at 9 in the morning would begin the first step of an arrangement that would redefine every assumption I had about choice, proximity, and the meaning of being bound to someone's world. The morning arrived earlier than I expected, not because of the time on the clock, but because sleep never truly came after the conversation in that Upper East Side residence. I remember standing by my apartment window in Queens before sunrise, watching the city slowly shift from silence into movement, trying to convince myself that yesterday had not redefined the structure of my life. At exactly 8:45, a black vehicle arrived outside my building. With the same quiet precision as before, its presence less like transportation and more like confirmation that refusal was no longer part of the equation. I stepped outside with a small bag I had packed twice and unpacked 3 times, unsure what was appropriate for a situation that had not been clearly explained. The driver greeted me with professional silence and opened the door. Inside, the air felt controlled, temperature perfectly balanced, the kind of detail that reminded me I was no longer navigating ordinary decisions. The ride through Manhattan felt different in daylight, sharper and more exposed, as if the city itself had become aware of my direction. We crossed streets I recognized but no longer felt connected to, passing landmarks that belonged to my old routine, now receding behind tinted glass, like memories I had not agreed to revisit. When we arrived at a private building near the financial district, there was no signage, no indication of purpose, only security that moved with practiced efficiency. I was escorted inside through a side entrance that bypassed public access entirely, and the silence of the interior felt deliberate, not empty. The corridor stretched longer than expected, lined with neutral tones and subtle lighting that made every step feel measured. At the end of the hall, a door opened before I reached it, as if my arrival had already been tracked. Richard Caldwell was there again, standing near a long table with a single folder placed at its center. He did not acknowledge surprise or delay, only gestured for me to approach as if this moment had already been scheduled long before I had agreed to anything. I noticed others in the room for the first time, individuals seated quietly along the walls, observing without expression, their presence suggesting structure rather than curiosity. When I reached the table, he asked if I had come willingly, and I told him I had, though the word felt complicated in my mouth. He then opened the folder and began outlining details I had not anticipated, not in terms of emotion or expectation, but in terms of logistics, boundaries, and time frames. He explained that what had begun as an arrangement was now transitioning into a defined period of observation and adjustment, where proximity would increase and external contact would decrease. I asked what exactly I was expected to do during this period, and he replied without hesitation that I would simply continue living under the structure already established, with certain conditions that would be clarified as necessary. There was no emphasis on control in his tone, only certainty that control already existed. I realized then that the room was not designed for negotiation but for alignment, and every person present understood their role within it except me. As I stood there listening, I became aware that the envelope from the night before was no longer relevant because I was now inside the system it had only described. When he finally closed the folder, he looked at me and said that beginning today, I would no longer be outside of his world, and that understanding what that meant would take time, whether I chose it or not. I remember the way the building felt different once I was officially inside its structure, as if the walls themselves understood I was no longer a visitor, but something being observed for adjustment. Richard Caldwell did not explain things the way people normally did in my world. There were no reassurances, no emotional framing, only clear expectations delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had already accounted for every possible reaction I might have. After the meeting ended, I was guided through another corridor, this one quieter than the last, until we reached a private suite that overlooked the city skyline. The driver who had brought me earlier was gone, replaced by a staff member who left without speaking once the door closed behind me. The room was not a prison, yet it did not feel like freedom either. Everything inside was carefully placed, minimal but complete, as if nothing unnecessary was allowed to exist within these walls. A small note rested on the table, not sealed, not formal, simply placed as if it belonged there. It contained a short list of expectations for the day, including meal times, scheduled movement within the residence, and a reminder that communication outside the property would be temporarily paused until further notice. I sat down slowly, reading the words more than once, trying to understand how silence could be structured so precisely. A knock came at the door later, and when I opened it, I found a woman who introduced herself as the residence coordinator. She spoke politely, professionally, explaining that my presence here was part of a transitional arrangement, and that my comfort was considered important within defined parameters. She offered to show me the property, and I agreed because refusal no longer felt like a meaningful option. We walked through hallways that were too large to feel personal, past rooms I did not need access to yet, each space designed with careful intention. There was a library, a meeting room, and a lounge area that overlooked the river. Everything felt functional, not decorative, as if the purpose of the environment was to support decisions rather than invite emotion. At one point, I asked her directly how long this arrangement was expected to continue, and she answered without hesitation that duration depended on alignment, not time. The answer stayed with me longer than I expected. Later, I was told that Richard Caldwell would be present briefly that evening, not for conversation, but for observation. When he arrived, it was without announcement. He stood near the doorway of the suite, not entering fully, simply looking at the space and then at me. He asked if anything felt unclear, and I told him everything felt unclear. He nodded as if that was the correct answer. He did not approach further, did not raise his voice, did not change his tone. Instead, he simply reminded me that clarity was not immediate in systems like this, and that adaptation was part of the process. When he left, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, not because it was empty, but because it felt structured with intention. I stood near the window afterward, watching the city lights reflect against the glass, realizing that nothing about my life outside these walls could reach me here without permission. And yet, strangely, what unsettled me most was not the restriction itself, but the certainty that every part of it had been designed with the expectation that I would eventually begin to understand it rather than resist it. I stopped trying to measure time inside the Caldwell residence because the structure of the days no longer followed anything I recognized. Morning began not with sunlight, but with quiet footsteps outside my door and a soft notification left on a tablet that appeared on the table each night like it had always been there. It contained schedules that looked simple at first glance, but felt strangely absolute once I began following them. Breakfast at a precise hour, a designated workspace overlooking the city, periods of silence intended for reading or reflection, and brief escorted walks through parts of the property that slowly expanded as the days passed. No one ever raised their voice, and no one ever hurried me, which somehow made everything feel even more controlled because nothing needed force to be understood here. Richard Caldwell did not appear constantly, but his presence felt continuous in a way I could not ignore. It was in the timing of instructions, in the way doors were never locked but always attended, and in the quiet awareness of staff who seemed to know my location without asking. On the third morning, I found a document waiting that outlined what they called an adaptation phase. It explained that observation was not about restriction, but about alignment, a word that kept appearing as if it carried meaning beyond its definition. I asked the residence coordinator what alignment meant in this context, and she answered carefully that it referred to understanding structure before making decisions within it. Her tone suggested she believed this was helpful rather than concerning. Later that day, I was invited to use a workspace overlooking the East River, where a laptop had been prepared for me without personal data, but with access to specific communication channels approved in advance. I noticed that everything I attempted to do there felt subtly guided, not through commands but through limitations of option, like walking through a path that narrowed without visible walls. When I asked if I could leave the property for a short walk outside, I was told it was possible but accompanied, and I realized I had begun to associate companionship with supervision rather than choice. In the afternoon, Richard Caldwell finally entered the room without announcement, standing near the doorway as if confirming something rather than initiating conversation. He asked if I was settling in, and I told him I was adjusting but did not yet understand the structure. He nodded as if that response was expected, and then stepped further inside for the first time since my arrival. He did not sit, only looked out toward the city and said that understanding would come in layers, not moments, and that resistance was not something the system was designed to react against, but to absorb. I asked him directly what my role was supposed to be in all of this, and there was a long pause before he answered. When he did, his voice was calm, almost distant, as if describing something already in motion long before I had arrived. He said my presence had already altered certain expectations within his world, and that roles were not assigned immediately, but revealed through time and behavior. After that, he left without further explanation, and the room felt different again, not because anything had changed visually, but because the boundaries of what I understood had quietly shifted once more. I remained by the window for a long time that evening, watching the city continue without awareness of the smaller world I had entered, realizing that nothing here demanded my agreement to continue moving forward, only my presence inside it. I no longer counted the days by hours or schedules after a while, because the rhythm of the Caldwell residence had begun to feel less like a place I was staying and more like a system I was slowly being integrated into. Everything remained quiet, but it was not empty quiet, it was structured quiet, the kind that made every sound feel intentional. That morning, instead of a schedule appearing on the tablet as usual, there was a single message requesting that I come to the main study at a specific time without explanation. I arrived exactly at the time listed, not because I felt compelled but because ignoring instructions no longer felt like something the environment would allow me to do without consequence, even when no consequence was ever spoken. The study was different from the rest of the residence, more personal but still controlled, with dark wood shelves and a wide desk that faced the city. Richard Caldwell was already there, standing by the window as he often was, as if he preferred distance even within his own space. When I entered, he did not turn immediately, only acknowledged my presence with a slight movement of his head, then asked me to sit. I did. There was a long pause before he spoke again, and during that silence I became aware that my breathing had started to match the stillness of the room. He finally told me that certain external concerns had shifted, and that adjustments would be made to my schedule going forward. I asked what kind of concerns, but he did not answer directly. Instead, he explained that environments like this one were not isolated from the outside world, and that part of my presence here involved becoming less exposed to unpredictability beyond these walls. The phrasing was careful, almost clinical, as if removing emotion made the explanation easier to accept. I asked him if that meant I was not allowed to leave, and for the first time, his response was immediate. He said I was always allowed to leave in principle, but that leaving without understanding context would be premature and potentially unsafe in ways I had not yet experienced. I did not fully understand what he meant, but the way he said it made it sound less like a warning and more like an observation of something already established. After that, he placed a thin folder on the desk in front of me and told me I could read it at my own pace. Inside were details about what he called security layers, movement permissions, and external visibility protocols, all written in the same precise language I had begun to associate with his world. None of it felt like a threat in the way I had once understood threats, but it also did not feel like choice. Later that afternoon, I was allowed to walk through a different part of the property for the first time without direct escort, though I could sense that my movement was still observed in ways that did not require physical presence. As I walked through the corridor leading to a glass-walled garden space, I noticed how every transition between areas felt intentional, as if designed to guide rather than confine. Richard Caldwell appeared again briefly near the end of the corridor, not blocking my path, but matching it for a moment as he walked beside me in silence. He asked if I felt restricted, and I told him I felt aware. He nodded as if that answer was closer to what he expected than any simple yes or no could have been. Before he left, he said something I did not immediately understand, that structure was not meant to replace freedom, but to define it, and that most people only recognized freedom when it had boundaries they could see. Then he stopped walking, turned slightly, and returned the way he came, leaving me alone in the corridor with the realization that I was no longer trying to decide whether I was part of his world, but beginning to understand that the question itself had already changed shape. I did not realize how quickly silence could become something that felt like a decision rather than an absence until the day everything inside the Caldwell residence shifted without warning. It began with small changes that I almost ignored at first, like subtle adjustments in timing of the usual schedule, and the absence of the tablet notification that normally guided my morning. Instead, a staff member arrived at my door and informed me that Richard Caldwell had requested my presence in the main study earlier than usual. When I arrived, he was already seated for the first time since I had been brought into his world, not standing by the window as he often was, but positioned at the desk with a calm focus that made the room feel heavier than before. He asked me to sit, and I noticed immediately that the usual distance between instruction and explanation had narrowed. He told me that what he called the adaptation phase was nearing completion, and that soon the structure surrounding my daily movement would no longer require adjustment because it would be fully integrated. I asked him what that meant in practical terms, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering that it meant understanding had reached a level where observation was no longer necessary in the same form. His words were measured, but there was something different in his tone that I had not heard before, not softer, but more final. He then placed a single document in front of me, not a schedule or a guideline, but something that outlined what he referred to as long-term alignment, including residence permanence, external communication restructuring, and identity integration within his operational environment. I remember reading the first page slowly, expecting the same emotional distance I had been learning to maintain, but something about the phrasing made it impossible to remain detached. It was not written as ownership or restriction, but as continuity, as if every previous step had already been leading here without interruption. I asked him if I still had the option to leave, and this time there was no immediate response. Instead, he leaned back slightly and said that option had never been removed, only redefined in terms of context and consequence. He explained that leaving was always physically possible, but understanding what I would be leaving behind was something that could not be undone once fully recognized. For the first time, I noticed that he was not watching me the way he had at the beginning, not measuring or assessing, but waiting, as if the next response was no longer about compliance or resistance, but about comprehension. I looked down at the document again, and the words no longer felt like instructions, but like boundaries that had already been crossed in stages I did not fully notice while they were happening. When I finally spoke, I told him I did not know what I was supposed to decide anymore, and he nodded once as if that was the only answer that mattered at this point. He stood after a moment and walked toward the window, then said something that stayed with me longer than anything else he had said before, that control was never about removal of choice, but about the point at which choice stops feeling separate from understanding. And in that silence that followed, I realized that nothing around me had changed again, yet everything I thought I understood about where I stood inside his world had already reached a point where turning back no longer felt like a direction that still existed. I did not realize the moment everything changed would feel so quiet. It was not announced, not explained, not introduced with any visible shift in atmosphere inside the Caldwell residence. It simply arrived the same way everything else had arrived in this place, with structure replacing uncertainty before I could fully recognize the transition. That morning, there was no schedule on the tablet, no staff member at my door, no instruction waiting to be followed. Instead, I found a single open space in the main residence already prepared as if it had been waiting for my presence without needing confirmation. Richard Caldwell was already there, standing by the long glass wall that overlooked the city, but this time he did not turn immediately when I entered. He waited, as if allowing the moment to exist fully before acknowledging it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm precision I had come to recognize, but the intent behind it felt different, not instructional, but definitive. He told me that the adjustment period had reached completion, and that what came next would not involve observation or evaluation, because those phases were no longer necessary. I asked him what that meant, and there was a pause longer than any silence I had experienced since arriving here. When he turned, his expression was steady but not distant, and he said that integration was no longer a process, but a condition that had already taken effect. I remember feeling a strange stillness at those words. Not fear exactly, but the absence of direction I had been relying on to interpret everything before this moment. He walked toward the table where the documents had once been placed and instead set down a single key card, something simple, physical, and final. He explained that it was access to every area I would need going forward, not as permission, but as acknowledgement of position. I asked him if this meant I was staying permanently, and for the first time, his answer was not layered or indirect. He said permanence was not something granted at a single moment, but something recognized after enough time had already passed to make reversal irrelevant. I stood there trying to understand where choice ended and continuation began, but the distinction no longer felt clearly defined. Outside the glass, the city moved as it always had, unaware of the quiet restructuring that had taken place within these walls. Richard Caldwell did not approach further, did not attempt to explain more than what had already been said. Instead, he simply acknowledged that what I had entered was no longer a phase of transition, but a stabilized state within his world. When he finally left the room, there was no final instruction, no closing statement, only the absence of uncertainty where it had once been. I remained by the window for a long time, holding the key card without fully understanding when it had stopped feeling like an object of entry and started feeling like confirmation that the boundaries I once believed existed outside this place had already shifted long before I realized I had crossed them.